Welcome back to this week's episode of Promising Young Surgeon. I'm your host, Dr. Frances Mei Hardin, and today it is my sincere pleasure to welcome back the brilliant Dr. Lauren Umstattd, a renowned facial plastic surgeon and the owner of Face Leawood in Kansas City. She also, back in the day, used to be my chief resident. And today we're going to be discussing a serious but often neglected topic, which is how to deal with challenges with co-residents or dealing with coworkers who have difficult personalities. A lot of this, as I mentioned, can be applied more broadly to the coworker space. It's not just co-residents, although looking at co-residents, particularly in a smaller surgical subspecialty, it does really form a pressure cooker that can bring some of these issues to light and allow us to look at some skills to handle these things. So Dr. Umstattd, thank you and welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to talk about a topic that I had no experience with until residency.
Exactly. I mean, just as a reminder, for most of us, residency is our first real foray into the workplace. So it's not as if a lot of us are seasoned, very gracious coworkers ourselves. And so I do want to open by saying, of course, everything we're discussing today, we are going to be calling a spade a spade. There are a lot of reasons that no one talks about the ugly underbelly of residency. And I, of course, philosophically believe, and I would argue that those reasons are just not good enough anymore. Like there are literally lives at stake. So resident physicians don't have often much of a life or even an identity outside of residency training. Any threats to their jobs while they're residents, those are existential threats often. And I also want to share this disclaimer, which is that, I've alluded to this in prior recordings, but I did have a residency experience where for the class after me, there were initially 2 residents in that year. One left the program and one was held back a year, which left a missing class of residents. Again, when we think of the pressure cooker of residency, this kind of exacerbated, well, 1, a workforce shortage, but also 2, it was a really challenging time for like the year leading up to those changes occurring. And so I just say all that because I want to use the disclaimer that like tincture of time has been very helpful for me personally. Dr. Umstattd, of course, was one of my seniors at the time and then ultimately chief resident. And we're going to have a conversation that we never could have had even something like 3 years ago, for sure, not 5 years ago. But there is this gift of hindsight and kind of looking at these problems and issues from a healed place. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think when you're in it, you see it one way, and then when you're past it, you see it another. I look at healthcare a lot like the aviation industry or the trucking industry. It's not that we work in an office and we do something that is easy peasy or that doesn't have an impact directly on the health of the community that we're serving. And so if you're a pilot and your co-pilot is impaired, it falls on you to report that because you are directly potentially harming the lives of the passengers that you're transporting. It's the same with healthcare. There's this unique responsibility of providers and nurses and respiratory therapists, basically everybody that touches healthcare, to ensure that the people that are providing care and involved in care are doing it in a way that is responsible and helpful, not malicious. But on top of that, lay the layer of an academic institution where you have all these doctors in training. So it's a very complex topic, but going into it, for all the listeners out there, you have the learner aspect and you have the public health aspect in the soup of the mess that we were in.
That's very true. I really appreciate that perspective. So, building on what you just said, like residency training, I think all of us can kind of agree, it's intense enough even under optimal conditions. And that's when, things are working right. It is really like, it's not for the faint of heart. There's so many other things we touch on, like sleep deprivation, documentation burden, things like that. But even when everything's going right, it's not an easy job. It's not easy peasy, like you said. And so when you now add challenges with co-residents or losing co-residents, things like that, then things are even much harder. And so what I just wanted to open up the conversation with is, like, how do you feel upon reflection and so many years later? Oh my gosh, I should say one so. It's not like so. Dr. Umstattd and I are still very young spring chickens, but like we'll just say so many years later where we're reflecting back, like, how do you feel like you personally handled situations dealing with the challenging co-resident, or even the scenario that you're describing where there are concerns about like safety with a co-resident? And then I'll kind of, I guess share some of the thoughts that I've had about it over the years.
So to give the audience a little bit more background, there were two residents in our program, both younger than us, that were underperforming. At that is a subjective statement. When you look at the responsibilities of a resident, they're vast. You have to be professional, you have to be timely. Those are like the basics. And then beyond that, you have to show the ability to learn. We go into residency basically knowing nothing. And you have a set number of years to train you for your career. In our residency, we had 5 years from when we walked in the door to when we should be able to take care of patients independently. Mm-hmm. And I think something that's more unique to surgical residencies is that the senior residents are intimately involved in the oversight and teaching of the younger residents. Rarely did our attendings even round with us. I think I could remember maybe less than 5 times that I would round with an attending. So the senior residents take a huge responsibility in terms of ensuring that the team is doing their job and that people are progressing at the appropriate level. So early on, it became pretty apparent to me and one of my co-residents that 2 of the younger residents were not doing well. They were having problems with, even simple things like arriving on time, showing up to the right clinic. One of them didn't even have a car, which was interesting because in our residency program, we were like all over town, all over, the different campuses. Which that's kind of the first thing. It's like you actually have to do the easy things first, and then you learn the hard things. The harder things are like seeing a consult, critical thinking, relaying important information to your senior resident. One step up from that is actually being a provider, coming up with ideas on, what's going on with the patient, what we should suggest as a consulting team, doing the actual procedures. So in the ER, a lot of times it's the junior resident doing the procedure independently, all the way up to really complex head and neck surgery cases where they're assisting with surgery. And so kind of progressively over the first couple of years, it became clear that there was a pattern. Everybody has bad days, bad weeks, cases where they're not prepared, or nights when they're just so sleep deprived that your performance is like a C+. Mm-hmm. But every day cannot be a D- day. That is unsustainable. It puts a lot of pressure on the team. And then ultimately, as the supervising resident, it's like, is this person okay to see patients on their own? And I think particular to these 2 residents that were underperforming, I personally, in retrospect, think that there was a lot of ego that was problematic. They were unwilling to recognize that they were underperforming, and they were unwilling to take great direction from the senior residents. It's not like, I was young and underperforming when I was younger too, but you have to be hungry to listen, hungry to improve, hungry to get better because you really have that 5 years to become a good surgeon and a good clinician, a good diagnostician, a good communicator. And so it got really awkward because the co-resident and I were like, there's something off here. And we tried correcting things pretty simply in the beginning, direct feedback. You got to show up on time. You got to read the schedule. You got to, listen to the things that I tell you. And those are what go in your notes to the consulting team, for the other teams. And then we had to pull in our program director, who is kind of the boss of all the residents.
Right.
We sat down with the program director and we said, like, I don't know how much you know, but from our perspective, both of these physicians are underperforming and they're really hard to teach. It is hard to manage them. We need your help. And I think our program director, in retrospect, was too busy clinically or administratively to be a great support system during a difficult time for our program. And I've not talked to the program director since all of this occurred, but I would assume that he also has some different opinions now that it's all done. Um, Ultimately, I felt like it was placed on, the co-resident and I, both senior residents, to try to fix this problem, which, like you said, I'm not a teacher. I don't know how to do all that. I'm also trying to run an entire surgical service. So we were asked to keep track of all the deficiencies, inefficiencies of these residents. Things continued to get worse and worse and worse. We tried sitting down with this one particular resident who really had a hard time every week. So both senior residents sat down with a junior resident once a week and talked about how he did that week. We tried to put it all on paper, but it didn't really help anything. The ego was still there. It seemed like this resident thought that he was doing a good job, which was so bizarre to me. And so then things shifted from me trying to help them to me basically reporting all the problems that I was seeing. Things continued to devolve. This is over years,
Right.
where he progressively got more responsibility. And it got to the point where I felt uncomfortable supervising him. Worst case scenario, he does something horrible to a patient. We have legal action, and I'm named because I'm his supervising senior resident. So it got to the point, and I don't think I've ever said this before to anybody, but I told my program director, I will not supervise him. If he and I are the two residents on call overnight, I will call the operator and have all the pages directed to me because I do not trust him to even take a call from an outside ER or an outside physician. It got to the point where he was almost being defiant and doing things without running them by me. And then I graduated and I left, and he was asked to leave the program. I don't know. So that was a lot, but just to give the audience kind of a background of what happened.
Yeah, I think that that's really helpful. Like, I appreciate you laying it all out like that. It honestly, it is pretty sad to hear back, like you're very right. I definitely would corroborate everything like how you lay it out. But it's interesting too, because even when I try to, well, one, I benefit from some distance, time and space from this. And so even if I'm listening to this kind of coming new to the table and you're describing to me something that you lived through, I think that really the glaring thing is how isolating it would have been for you and your co-resident, because it does sound like things were done in good faith, like attempting to, as a responsible and engaged senior resident, address things directly with the junior resident who is struggling. Like, absolutely. I think that that makes a lot of sense. Probably a lot of senior residents, people who have experienced that, can relate to, yeah, having to do that. And, you know, like I can, as a junior resident, I received helpful feedback absolutely from senior residents. Hey, it's X and Y and Z. Make sure that you're building these things up. That makes a lot of sense. What gets me is how, when you guys were hitting a wall, like after a lot of attempts, and again, this good faith effort with your junior resident, then going to basically admin, like, yes, the program director, but really, like, I think that people would say that the department does have some kind of a fiduciary responsibility to the residents who work for that department. So we'll just say admin then didn't provide really any guidance or any intervention, like that next level that things needed to escalate to. And, you know, I don't say this in a way like, how much respect I have for you and your co-resident, but literally there's a way of looking at this where it feels like, a lot of residencies, especially these smaller ones, are kind of like dysfunctional families. And it's almost like, the 13-year-olds went to the parents and they were like, honestly, there's something wrong with the 8-year-old. And the
You're
parents were
you
like,
are you're so spot on. I literally before this morning, I was trying to think of an analogy. That's literally an analogy I came up with. It's like
yeah,
we were 12-year-olds. We hadn't even hit puberty yet. And we were responsible for grocery shopping, doing the laundry,
yeah,
cleaning. Like we were responsible for raising the younger family. And I felt like when we hit some difficult speed bumps with these difficult, I hate to call them children because that's not what it was. But if we keep rolling with that analogy, our
yeah.
parents were like, sorry, we're at work. We're too busy. We're not coming home ever.
I know. And imagine that it wasn't just because, honestly, that's like on a good day. Like, yeah, you did just you had a lot of responsibility over the junior resident. So you were like, you had to feed us, do the laundry, do all this regular stuff. But then it's like, imagine that the 8-year-old, okay, well, now the school is calling because they set, a garbage can on fire. And
Yeah.
you like, okay, you need to discipline and like sort things out with this kid. And you need to make sure that it doesn't like, commit crimes. And that it is so glaring. And I do think that it offers, like, in terms of, well, what can be gained from this, like it does offer this conversation about like what is the appropriate role, because it just cannot be that this ultimately falls on the senior residents' shoulders, let alone the fact that you guys in that situation, you're still in training, like you are still trying to squeeze every bit of learning out of these last year plus of training to go on to have a successful career. So then add on dealing with underperforming junior residents, underperforming to the extreme.
Well, and every field in medicine has things that are higher urgency, more critical. In the world of head and neck surgery, airways are number one. Airways are always scary. You have to always be on your game with any airway call. And so I just felt like he was progressing to the point where he was getting more and more responsibility. And I, at the core of my soul, I knew that he was unable to be on his game when minutes count. And that was really the shift when I went from trying to help him to trying to get him out of our program. And do I think, like in retrospect, I was potentially too critical of his performance? Maybe. But I also think towards the end, before he left, there were huge mistakes made. Obviously we can't discuss them with HIPAA and everything, but I think the end result of him leaving was the right thing. Do I think that the way we went about it was perfect? No. But it was literally the best I could do at the time.
I, yeah. And I think that, the way that it went down, and again, the lack of maybe like any formal real intervention from like the admin level, it put a lot of strain on the whole resident cohort, I think, because of course I experienced all of this from a different level. I was still in a senior role to them, but I was still, relatively a junior to mid-level resident. And I mean, I think that when I think back of ways that I handled issues with them, where maybe like I am alone with an underperforming junior to me, we are jointly seeing a consult, I did run into multiple various types of issues where I would just say, okay, well, this is the plan. And it would be met with, no, that's not a good plan. I have a different plan. And I remember being kind of stunned in those scenarios. I can be pretty stoic, and especially if somebody has like surprised me or if I'm like taken off guard, that externally doesn't look like much. I have my regular RBF and, I don't move or anything like that. And you would just be like, is this person alive in there? But internally, I tend to be like more shut down and avoidant. And so it is tough because going back to the things that we aren't trained to do, like, especially at the point that I was at, like, you're really learning new things every day. You are really ramping up, your clinical responsiveness. And it is at that juncture where you need to be making calls for yourself. Well, one thing that no one prepares you for is when you get the correct diagnosis, you have the correct treatment plan, and then your junior is like, no, we're not doing that, man. Like, that's not right. I have just a different idea. I'm going to do my idea. That is really hard. And I mean, especially when there wasn't like a cope ahead. Like, I had never seen anyone do stuff like that. I did not have the professional skills to like respond to that effectively and then like get us through it. It's tough. That feels like the blind leading the blind.
Well, and I think, I brought up the concept of ego for a reason because one of my very best friends, who is also in medicine, she's in a different field, she went to a different training institution, but she was an underperformer early on in her residency program. And her program director and her co-residents came to her and said, I don't think this is the right field for you. Let's work together to get you in a different program, a different field of medicine. And so, because of her lack of ego and because of her departmental support, she now is a wonderfully successful physician in a field that is a better fit for her. And I think that's the most important thing here is like, if your program comes to you and says like you're underperforming, you're a shitty resident, you need to take a step back and say like, do they have a valid point here? And I felt like when we went to these two residents, they had this ego of like, nope, I know everything. And so then it became less of a work together relationship of like, let's get you better. And it became more of an adversarial relationship where it was me against you. And I brought all this up to my program director when I first recognized that this was a bad situation with, particularly one, but then the other resident as well. And I said, like, one of my best friends, like she had to transition out of the field that she was in, transitioned into a different field. Did she have to repeat some years of training? Yes. Did it suck? Yes. But ultimately, she is now a practicing and successful physician. And so I felt like I gave that path to my parent, so to speak, to my program director, right. But I don't feel like they were as involved in the process as they should have been. And again, this is a retrospective view of things, but the ego was one of the biggest problems in this case, is that both of these residents thought that they knew everything, which no resident knows anything. You come in, you make mistakes, you learn every day. Like you're not supposed to know anything. You're supposed to learn. Learning is the most important thing. And they were, in a certain sense, unwilling to learn.
I think that that's very true. I definitely agree with the ego component. And again, I want people to know, like, I don't say that in a judgmental way because I definitely could have been a better resident myself, like at every level, in many different ways. So I don't want people to think that I say any of that in this like way where I'm in the ivory tower. I was the dream resident, and and they weren't. So it's not like that. But I do agree with, and I will even specifically say that when I was a junior resident, some of the feedback that I got was that I was not good at receiving feedback, which is ultimately, still routes around to an ego problem. So I definitely like have consciously worked on that for several years since. But, we aren't saying anything too crazy here. Like, if you can't think of a doctor with some level of an ego problem at some points in their life, like, I don't know, maybe you don't know these doctors too well. So, I do say all of that with a grain of salt. But when I do think of, and I agree with, of course, like Lauren is saying, we're not going into specifics. It's not like that. I think that the story kind of speaks for itself, but to give an example of something that goes in that first layer, like that basic layer of what she was saying falls under the responsibility of a dutiful resident who is able to meet expectations. It even includes like answering the phone. There were issues just in terms of like not being able to find people when outside calls, consults, things like that were being called. And that definitely can be dangerous, because when we think of the airway emergencies that we respond to, if one element of that is that the junior who's getting the airway emergency call can't be reached, okay, well, we might be losing life-saving minutes for sure.
Mhm. I also think it brings up a concept of, you talked about, you are not a perfect resident. There's no such thing as a perfect resident or a perfect human,
Yep.
but there's a range of acceptable error in my mind.
Yes.
You are going to have not great days. You are going to have things that you miss clinically, diagnostically, but you shouldn't be way out in left field every single day, right? Your margin of error, or your range of error, should continue to tighten as you go through residency. You should get better and better and better. And I felt like the margin of error, or the range, was way, way, way too big for these two individuals. And again, thinking about how I was going to talk about all this today, if anybody has listened to Dr. Death, that is a very interesting topic to go into. It was, for anybody who's unfamiliar, it was a podcast a while back. It was a story of a neurosurgeon who graduated from his residency program and went out as a practicing neurosurgeon and hurt and killed a lot of people. And in no way am I comparing these residents to him, but it does bring up the idea of, how do these bad doctors graduate from their programs? Like, how do bad surgeons actually graduate? Like, doesn't someone actually sign, on the line of like, yes, this person is deemed appropriate to be a full-fledged surgeon or physician in the United States? Well, his program, at least to my knowledge, he's still not spoken about the whole topic, but I assume that he was underperforming and that it's just easier to push someone through and let them graduate and just not hire them as part of your team. It's really, really hard to fire or terminate a resident. And so, in my opinion, I think that for the Dr. Dust situation, he probably was a horrible resident. But each person had kind of a limited interaction with him because he was probably supervised by his co-residents. Those co-residents were probably so busy in their own world, they just didn't say anything, or they did say something and the department said, you know what, it's just easier to let him graduate, because if we terminate him or let him leave, force him out, there will probably be litigation involved, and we don't want to deal with that as a department. So I personally think that all of these horrible doctors that are out there, which are few and far between, but I think there were probably signs of them being incompetent, egotistical, unwilling to put the patient's need first. And I think the program probably just pushed them through because it's easier logistically, it's safer legally. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, 100%. Although I think that it kind of feels like the short game. Like it is safer legally because legally it can be very tenuous to get rid of a resident. But I just wonder if in the future there's some world where when a doctor death happens, like, is there any legal responsibility of the program that graduated that person and signed on the dotted line? I think that what you're bringing up hits on a lot of the major points, absolutely, that I wanted to highlight as well, which for people who maybe have not yet experienced or just work in a different industry, haven't experienced like this attending dynamic, as you mentioned, and I'll take it even a step further because this was anecdotally, I can just speak to my experience, which is that in my experience, attendings primarily their interaction with the resident was to have the resident do a lot of the work and make their life as easy as possible. That was my experience. It wasn't like a teacher learner relationship, it was like a cog in a wheel relationship. And so typically, and I think that there may even be an element where this was true applied in this case, the attendings just wanted their lives to be like as smooth and easy as possible. They wanted things to run correctly and they wanted to not be bothered. Like as long as good patient care was occurring and just like no one was calling them or bothering them, it would be like 2 thumbs up. And when it does affect them directly, like for instance, what began happening, or at least, what I was directly involved in back at this time, was that now the underperforming residents, their work was directly impacting the attendings, the cases, workflow in that way. And then the attendings were like, okay, well, something needs to be done. I mean, I think that that was quite some time, very long after you and your co-resident had been doing this like hard work on the ground, trying to improve things for the residents and like trying to work with them and make things better.
Yeah, I think the more senior you become in your residency, the more direct contact you have with the attendings. So certainly as those residents progressed over the years, it became more apparent to the department that they were underperformers. The problem is that, again, back to this public safety thing, is that they had been taking care of people, this whole time. It's just that their underperformance was unrecognized by the department attendings. And not to say that we like covered it up, but there was more of a safety net, you know, with your senior residents, correcting your notes, calling pages back for you that you miss, being right by your side during more urgent airway things. But I'm interested to hear you talk more about, I talked about how I graduated and then I kind of heard about things from you guys after the fact. How did kind of the final days, how did the department tell you? I mean,
Oh man. Yeah, that's interesting because I've mentioned this before, but there are for sure still pretty substantial chunks of residency that I just have like black boxes over like the memories for that. But let me do my best recollection, and I have a note here because I did want to talk about these special extra meetings that we had to attend. And I say this because I I talk about the strain that occurred for the whole cohort, I think. And we all managed it in different ways. One of the ways that I coped was like increased alcohol intake for sure, because it was just like this global stressor that affected all of us. But we began having like more meetings in the conference room as a residency group without those residents in attendance. And the program director would basically say, don't text about them. They had started recording morning rounds. So now like that was being secretly recorded on their cell phones. Like every morning you could kind of see that, and that was something being done to kind of like collect legal evidence. Although I'm still, then there were all these questions like, was that legal in the state that we're in to have like, non-disclosed, non-consented, like, voice recordings? I don't remember, but that was a question that was raised. And there were all these things like, okay, well, don't text about them. Like, you guys are going to get subpoenaed. Like, you don't want to go to the stand about this. So don't do this and this and this. And when I tell you that residency is already quite stressful, the threat of the subpoena and having these were extra meetings that occurred at the end of the workday in the early evening, like for several weeks.
Okay, hold on, I'm going to pause for a second. That is so interesting to me because as I look back on all of this, it's like we were begging for help.
Yeah.
Why didn't the attendings round with us? Why didn't they take call with us nights and weekends? I mean, if they wanted direct evidence that these people were underperforming, like rather than being sneaky about it, why didn't they get more involved?
Oh, the residents were recording us. Not the but yeah, the residents were recording morning rounds, and that was a whole problem. Like the
No, but
underperforming residents. But yes,
oh,
yeah. So
good.
that felt like a little menacing and threatening. Like, but I think that your point is exactly right. Because, so it's like, well, why wouldn't the attendings coming round with us? I mean, once the underperforming residents started recording rounds, the attendings were like, yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't want any part in that. Like, you're never going to catch me in one of these recordings, and I don't want to be subpoenaed. So, if anything, I feel like some of the litigiousness that occurred further distanced attendings from the residents.
And
They just were like, good luck. And they were like, don't say anything that could be used against you in court, because these are going to, at least one is going to go to court.
interesting. Okay. That is okay. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. And I like your point, because if an involved attending, and again, at some point, admin should be involved in this because it was brought to their attention by like responsible, honest senior residents. But I have never heard much in terms of the solution to the problem is for attendings to do much more work. Like, I've never seen that be pitched. I've never seen that be accepted. And I cannot imagine a world where that happens, because what you're describing, where the attendings then do come more boots on the ground and they take an evening of call with this junior resident to just genuinely see, like, are they doing the bare minimum? Yes or no? That means that the attending would be taking an evening of call.
And I just feel like and this is me not being an academic attending, but I feel like if you are at an institution where you have residents and you are responsible for their training, I just don't think that's too hard of an ask. Like, you're literally responsible for these little humans, these little chicks becoming chickens and, leaving your farm one day. I just don't feel like asking the attendings to have been more involved is that big of an ask. I mean, I know we're all busy in our own lives, but that is part of their job.
It is, but I've not ever seen stuff like that happen. I mean, another good example of this is that at one point we were all sat down in a departmental meeting, and we were informed that we were now going to cover call for a hospital 33 miles away, and it would be covered by residents. And we all talked jointly about like a lot of concerns for safety of residents driving on a pitch black like country highway road in the middle of the night to go see some little consults down there. And one of the things proposed was that attendings would cover that call, because the department kept saying like, this won't be onerous at all. It'll be like very, very light, like maybe the occasional phone call, but like it won't be anything. And so it kind of was like, well, why don't the attendings take it? And they did for 1 year. And then at the turn of the new year, then it was like mandatory. It was like, this is senior resident coverage. And I personally almost would have fallen asleep at the wheel at 2 a.m. driving in the pitch black down 33 miles away to like look at a
Yeah.
PTA. One time they called me down for a peritonsillar abscess. I kid you not. I go down at 2 a.m. And when I talked to her in the emergency room, because honestly, it was like 1.5 centimeters. It was like right borderline, could do conservative management, could do an IND. So I was like, hi, okay, good to meet you. I did my full intro. I did the whole spiel, did the exam. I was like, okay, well, I'd like to drain it. This is how we do that. And she was like, no. She was like, absolutely not. Wouldn't consent to it. She just went home on antibiotics and like did fine. And they didn't have that convo with her before I did a, quite lengthy midnight drive.
Well, and this brings up the concept of like, how vocal should you be as a resident? Because I remember when the department was thinking about taking or covering call at this community hospital, I would say my class was extremely vocal. Um, and we immediately were like, no, we will not. It's not in our contract. We're working more. You're not, pay is like ridiculous, but it's like, no, we're absolutely, that is a safety issue number one. We have to be within like 10, 15 minutes of the hospital at all times on home call because we do get a fair number of like urgent airway consults. And I remember that both the co-resident and I that were more vocal about this one resident, we both immediately were like, no, that's not safe. But then I think the department, I also think the class below me had a resident that was pretty vocal for good or
Yeah.
bad. And then I feel like, your class potentially was a little bit more taken advantage of. And not to
Well,
say
they
that you
had
guys,
me. No, I mean, you're right though. Like they were my co-residents were more more agreeable. And I was vocal, but I didn't have, a counterpart who would be vocal with me. And in terms of was I as vocal as some of you guys? No, in part because I can read a room. So if I'm going into a fight that's like 10v1, I'm going to be a little quieter.
yeah, but even as a senior chief resident, you're definitely subordinate to your attendings. And so it's like, yeah, when should you speak up and say no? Or when should you speak up and say this resident sucks, they need to leave? It's this weird dynamic because you really are the doers of most of the work, like in the department. I don't
Well,
know. It's a hard period of time in so many ways.
well, yeah, and I think that, your rights as a resident, how to handle it if you feel the need to speak up, that is like such a in-depth convo for another day, but I do want to finish answering, your great question about like, well, how did this end? It was like quite some turmoil for many years, wore on a lot of us. When it finally, so again, there were all these meetings, there was a lot of legal threat, there was a lot of people being uncomfortable on morning rounds, like I said, because they were being quote unquote secretly recorded, even though like you could kind of see this person like open up voice memos and like record and then have it in their pocket, and we would go round. But what was really difficult at the time, and I still think unfair looking back, was how even when it ended, everything was truly, truly shrouded in mystery. And that is in part because the department, when asked, the department would be like, well, there's legal processes undergoing, so I can't say anything. But the issue with that is that then now, residents making the schedule, they're in the dark. Residents wondering like, am I ever going to see this person again? They're in the dark. There were a couple scary instances, and I think this happened right before you graduated one time, where one of the residents who was not actively working just showed up in the resident office. All their badge access was still 100%. And actually, to go back to the safety issue, because the safety of it, the lack of safety of it all is troubling. Even when the resident was let go, that person was still seen fairly frequently around, including like in hospital facilities, things like that. And it was brought to the attention of admin. I remember this meeting very vividly because I'm like, someone asked, probably me asked, because I would now be like the last vocal resident left. And I was like, hey, in front of the group here, like, I just want to ask, like, there's been talk, like, this person is just actively seen around in like resident spaces, call rooms, office, things like that. My understanding is that they don't work here anymore. Do they still have badge access? And literally the attending was like, that's weird. I mean, I assume that they wouldn't, but like, let me look into it. Guess what? A few days later, they were like, hey, thanks for mentioning that. They did have full badge access. They were just still at the hospital most days.
And like, why the hell are you at the hospital if you don't work here anymore? That is creepy.
Well, it just goes back to like, the nebulousness of it, the safety concerns of it. It I think that the more that people can communicate in an honest and straightforward way, the better for all, like the safer for all. And also probably then you're going to get more buy-in from the residents, because like, not only was the whole way that this was handled for years somewhat botched, including at the admin level, really, but then like the way that the aftermath was handled was like, I mean, barely an announcement of these changes. And then when residents voiced like, okay, well, now there's a missing class of residents, like, what's going to happen with that? It was just pretty much ignored. My class did the work of my class and the year behind us, the missing class, for the rest of residency.
Yeah, there's no there's no great solution, because it left you the fact that they did one resident was asked to leave, one was held back a year, left an entire missing class, which puts so much more work on the residents who are showing up to work every day and doing their job. And that's not fair. Although life's not fair.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But like, we did spend a lot of time, like when I was a 5, when we were chief residents, we spent a lot of time like trying to talk through, okay, so there's no 4s. So senior call, instead of being 5 residents like usual, is 3 residents. So like, how could we just slightly offset that a little bit? And I proposed, a dozen different models, including where every attending took like one call a year. Well, guess what? If every attending agreed to do that, then that would have kind of made up a fourth person. We asked for the fellow to help cover, which ultimately happened a little bit, but not like in a meaningful way. So we just stayed kind of like Q3. And it just goes back to the fact that like, you have to make it work for yourself. Like, no one's gonna kind of help make a solution happen because we don't have buy-in from admin. Like, this problem was very unique. Like, it affected the chief resident and the chief residents only. Didn't affect the attendings at all if they were missing 2 chief residents. Maybe a little bit in terms of coverage, but they mostly just like went on with normal business. But it, almost doubled the work that we had. And another way in which I will say that this like very, very directly affected like my training experience. So I do have like one rock bottom day, like one worst day ever in residency. Do not want to go into it. I've maybe mentioned it previously, but one day we can get into it. But it was just brutal. And I was a 4th year. So I was a 4th year at the time, no PGY3s. And I was doing a neck dissection with an attending. And I was definitely having a hard time with it. Like, again, I don't want to be like a person who can't own their stuff because of ego. And so agreed, like I was not oriented, I was not facile. But here's the thing. It was only like my second one ever. And that is weird for someone who's made it to PGY 4 level, like in terms of like me being the first assist, which means there weren't other residents present. Because sometimes if you're like the second holding resident, then you're like upside down, you're coming in and out, you might be closing a flap, like you could be doing it, you could be, harvesting a flap at that time. But basically, this was me and the attending and a off-service rotator. And I was just like I was really struggling. But what the attending said was, oh, what is this? I identified a muscle. I was correct, but I wasn't confident enough, quote unquote, in my response. And that's what led to this big blow up. But they were like, how many of these have you done? And I was like, I really apologize, like 2 or 3. And, my case numbers as first assist would have reflected that if you had pulled up the computer and pulled up the ACGME case logs and stuff. But they were like, that cannot be true. You are just unprepared. You're a liar. You didn't prepare. And that part's not true, right? Like I did prepare. When somebody scares me, I don't have incredible recall. I have otherwise actually quite a good memory, but like in this instance, it just really went off the rails very quickly. But that's the crazy part, is that literally even the attending was like, it is not possible that you've done so little of this like advanced case commensurate with your year. And I was like, it is true though. Well, first of all, like, why would I lie about that? And second of all, what's crazy is then we weren't given this grace that like understood. I actually was still doing a lot of PGY 3 cases at the time, right? There are no 3s. And when I was a 3, I wasn't really like advancing into doing these harder, bigger cases because I was doing PGY 2 cases, etc.
Yeah, I feel like I think there are a lot of differences between medical and surgical residencies. And I think that surgical residencies are just so unique in how much control the senior residents have and how much the structure of your actual residency has on your education. This is case in point. The fact that you are basically missing a class below you directly impaired your exposure and involvement in certain cases. And the attendings are so aloof. They're so removed from all of that that they had no clue that that was happening, which again kind of falls on them. Like that's literally their job is, yes, to see their own patients and take care of people and be a productive RVU generator in the department. But part of their job is to educate residents, ensure they're getting enough cases, enough exposure, enough time for certain things before they graduate. So really, that is a huge failure of the department.
Yeah, and it just, like, it was pretty traumatic. It definitely did not need to happen because I mean, like, whether or not I was missing a class, even if a resident's like struggling with a more advanced case, I still think that at a teaching institution, then you would teach them and not, berate them. But that's kind of a tangent. I do want to mention one other thing about Dr. Death specifically, because I liked that you use just not that like example for this, because we're not even comparing, but when I haven't done the podcast or the TV show, but I really liked like the initial long form on it. And they do go into, if I'm recalling, he did take multiple extra like research years in the sense that his clinical to research time was off. The ratio was quite skewed. So he did extra research, he did less clinical, and then even his case numbers at the time of graduation were unusually low, which I think reflects kind of what you were positing, which is that, oh, I'm sure that something was realized in real time, but an easy way to like take the quote unquote road of least resistance is to then guide that resident onto like more of a research, less clinical track. Like that's fine. This way you don't have to like go through the firing process. You don't have to really deal with them, and your patients won't be in danger. They're just going to be chilling elsewhere.
Yeah, basically we'll just get you through and then you're not our problem anymore. But again, that goes back to like, in the aviation industry, like I would assume that if there's a bad pilot, it is the responsibility of the aviation school to not allow that pilot to graduate.
Totally. And I think that even like, let's use the example in practice, like if I, a co pilot, report my co pilot, then like their parents, if we're going to use this kind of amusing, analogy, like the aviation admin, I do think that they would step in. Like they just like take that seriously. They wouldn't be like, okay, you sort it out with him. Like if he seems drunk or whatever. And so there's a lot that medicine can definitely take from aviation, I think, with how they deal with some of these personnel issues, error mitigation. But I really appreciate you basically, of course, taking the time to come chat with me today about this. I know it's not the most fun ever. Now I feel like we have to record another time just about like our favorite TV shows or something light, something like very fun. Because it's heavy stuff, but it is so important. And I've never seen anyone like really openly engage with these realities.
And I think, if you are a resident that's struggling and you feel like your range of error is too big, you feel like you're having a D- day every day. My personal recommendation would be to go to your attendings, go to your senior residents and say, with very minimal ego, I feel like I'm underperforming. Help me. Help me get better. Tell me the like objective deficiencies that I have every day and work really hard to correct those. Nobody's perfect. I had horrible days in residency as well. I had cases that I didn't do well on. I was not the top scorer in my in-service every year, but I was hungry to learn. And then I think if you're a resident that's struggling with your co-residents, my advice again is to go ask for help. Don't silo yourself off and feel like it's your responsibility. Even though I asked for help and I feel like it wasn't there, I'm so glad that I did that step, because had I not asked for help, I think this all would have been worse. So I think, in a big institution, even if you're in a small department, there are people that are in there. And so whether it's in your own department with your co-residents, your senior residents, your faculty, the ACGME office, there are things that you can reach out to, people you can reach out to. I don't know how much help there'll be, but you never know who will potentially be there to help you if you're struggling.
I think that that's such a great point, and I really agree with you. I would also put forth that like by at least reaching out for help, even that action, whether it's met with like really a productive response or not, it's like I bet you'll sleep better at night having done it.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
and you have to live with, one of the big overarching themes of all this is like one day eventually, thank God, residency ends, and you have to live with how you handled it for the rest of your life. So like for instance, I'm glad that I spoke out about the things that I spoke out about, whether or not that led to direct change or effect or anything. I at least am glad that I didn't, just like squash it down or just like totally, allow abuse to happen in silence. Like I do feel like voicing some of those things is better than the alternative, especially in the long run.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even if you're the first person to raise concern about something and nothing actually happens, if there are six people behind you that raise the same concern, the fact that you spoke up initially provides validation to all of your guys' concerns about something.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Umstattd. It is absolutely always a joy to speak with you. And thank you again for joining me back on here today. Where can our listeners find and connect with you online?
Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, just at Lauren Umstattd, MD.
Awesome. Well, we'll absolutely link those in the show notes. Follow me on Instagram at francismay.md and at Rethinking Residency. Visit my website, rethinkingresidency.com, to learn more about resident physician stories and ways that residents can most effectively navigate the game of residency. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Promising Young Surgeon. Be sure to subscribe, rate us, and leave a review. If you'd like to submit any questions for future episodes, email me at pys@heyinfluent.com.